Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. My name's Matt Freese. I'm here with my co-host, Nick Olson. Nick, how we doing today?
I'm doing well, Matt. We have ground the tape. We have spent hours and hours grinding these cornerback prospects. So we're getting back to tape talk, to Kindred Skulls roots. I'm pumped for it. I finally get to show the fruits of all this labor as I've been sitting in a basement grinding tape for hours and hours on end. So excited to dive into it. We got the draft, just weeks away. So I'm pumped.
Yeah, some of us, or at least one of us, was grinding up to like 30 seconds before we started this call. So it's going good. It's going good. No, I think it's always interesting trying to source college football all 22. So we don't have complete profiles for one or two of these guys, but I think we have a pretty good jump on an idea, especially looking. I think all the talk is a corner for the Vikings at 12. No secret of to let you guys in on a secret. That's who we're talking about today is cornerbacks that the Vikings might look at 12. And there are some really intriguing guys, so I'm excited to get into it. But first off, I think we want to generally talk about, what a Vikings draft under Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah might look like. Right. And obviously we've spent a long time with Rick Spielman as a GM. He had a very consistent draft strategy, right? It was always he's going to get at least 10 picks on draft day. If he doesn't, or during the draft, if he doesn't make 10 picks during a draft, it's like, he's dying of thirst right at the end of it. So it'll be interesting to see now that Spielman's no longer here, what the Vikings' general strategy is. And then also, Rick had tendencies in terms of what he would draft for athletic profiles or general prospect profiles and positional value. I mean, it was talked about a lot how we drafted like 4 corners in the first round under his tenure, right? So it'll be kind of interesting to go through and see what Kwesi does different. So I guess the first topic of conversation we can talk about is general trade philosophy. Right. We just saw a big NFL draft trade between the Eagles and Saints. And you had, I guess, one of the more analytically minded franchises in the Eagles. Right. They do tend to use a lot of, analytics is such a buzzword that it's kind of hard to gauge exactly how analytically in terms of the thought process, some of these teams that use quote unquote analytics are. But, Brandon Brown, one of the prospects we were looking at, was thought of very highly as somewhat, even though he'd come from the football side, is kind of a good mind in the analytics space as well. And Catherine Reich obviously is in the front office, who we interviewed as well. So they got a lot of surplus value for trading with the Saints, who are one of the more impulsive drafting teams, right? And I guess for the Vikings trade philosophy, there have already been rumors swirling around about a potential trade with the Chargers down to 17. Seen those in the past couple of days. So I think, and let me know if I'm off base here, that if I'm expecting the Vikings to trade in the first round, it's a trade down to gain more value in the draft. Would you disagree there?
No, I think that's right. It's hard to see them trading up necessarily, even if they're in love with one of these cornerbacks. I think the first cornerback off the board will probably be Sauce Gardner, and he's really good. I don't want to jump the gun a little bit on our analysis here, but he's also the kind of cornerback who would probably be best in a cover 3 press man kind of scheme, or a cover 1 where he's doing a lot of. I mean, he's so long, and you want to put those tools to their best use, and that's not really Donatel's scheme. I mean, you can obviously, and you mix it all up together, but it's a scheme that relies a lot less on that cover 3, and probably with the way they've set it up right now with the guys on so many zone ready guys on the roster, probably less cover 1 than you saw last year with the Broncos. So. That's not the kind of guy that I think Kwesi would trade up for in this draft. And other than that, I don't think any of these other guys are necessarily, positional guys that you would trade up for. Obviously, most general analytics would suggest trading up for non-QB players usually doesn't pan out very well. We are a little overconfident in estimating who's going to be the best prospect among a given tier. Easy example to point to in recent drafts was Bradbury was the number 1 ranked center a few years back, but the Packers guard Elton Jenkins and the Saints
McCoy, Eric McCoy.
Eric McCoy were like kind of in a similar tier and went later in the second round, and those guys wound up being a lot better than Garrett Bradbury. That happens a lot in the draft. We think, oh man, this guy's just clearly a tier above, but it turns out, the draft is so random that we underestimate just how much randomness goes into it. So if he is an analytics friendly guy, he probably will be more trading down. It'll be more of the same that we saw with Rick Spielman. I think Andrew Berry in Cleveland did a little bit more trading down than trading up. They did trade up for JOK last year, so that and that one panned out for them certainly.
Yeah.
So I think you could probably see a little bit of both. But I would think, one, just given what Andrew Berry did and Kwesi's analytics background, you're more likely to see a trade down. I also think, given the current status of the board, you're more likely to see the Vikings in a position where they have a few different guys on the board that they would be fine trading down and just taking the best of kind of what they did with Christian Darrisaw last year, where there were 4 guys on the board that they were would have been happy taking any of them, but they're happy to trade down, pick up some extra draft capital. I've seen the Steelers, kind of our Ian Rappaport reported today that they're looking for a quarterback in this draft, so you could definitely see another sort of Justin Fields-like trade where it's their current first plus a future first to move up to 12 or something. So something like that would be awesome if that kind of, if one of the quarterbacks fell to 12 and somebody was willing to trade up for it there. So that's what my dream scenario would kind of look like, would be, trade down to 20 and take one of these other corners that I think will still be very good. We'll see if that is the ultimate strategy they end up taking. But like I said, given Kwesi's analytics background, given what Andrew Berry has done in Cleveland in the last few years, I think trade down is probably more likely. But we could also see trade ups if there's a specific cliff of value that is worth targeting the same way they did with JOK.
Yeah, and I think there's another important point to tease out there, which is that trading up in the first round is a lot more expensive than trading up in subsequent rounds, right? So there's a value of prime picks in the draft. And really, once you get outside of the top 100, and maybe it's even the top 50, top 60 type of players, you really start to have a cliff of value where you have players who you're not expecting to be immediate contributors, right? And that's something I think we even saw last year with the way the Vikings draft. We took a ton of guys in the 3rd and 4th round, and very few of them immediately contributed. But in the first round, because of the quarterback mania, and I think the quarterback mania is what plays into this, teams are willing to give up so much to go up and get quarterbacks that it raises the price for other items as well. I think the Eagles traded up from 12 to 10 last year to draft Devontae Smith, and they ended up spending a 3rd round pick. That's a premium pick, right? When the Jets traded up for Elijah Vera Tucker, they sent us 2 3rd round picks. Again, maybe not guys you expect to contribute right away, but hopefully guys who could contribute down the line, right? And they're within that top 100 range. I think those teams, and we mentioned the Eagles as maybe a more analytically minded team, but they, if you remember, had traded back and gained a 1st round pick already in the draft, right? So they were playing a little bit with house money in that case. So, at that point, I think it'll be rare for the Vikings or somebody with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah's profile to trade up for a player unless it's specifically a quarterback, which the Vikings clearly aren't going after in this draft. Once you get into the later rounds, I think it makes more sense to trade up. If you remember the Vikings back in 2017, we traded up for, I believe, both Dalvin Cook and Pat Elflein in that draft, right? Obviously, one worked out pretty well, the other did not so much, but examples of that movement to get a guy where you think there's a cliff, where you think he's fallen too far, or there's a cliff in value there, you're not giving up nearly as much. You might be, sending an extra 5th round pick or swapping later round picks to make that deal instead of, either giving up future assets or giving up premium picks in the draft. And I think that's an important distinction to make. So on top of that, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, one other thing I just put in there is, yes, we have a new general manager, but so much of the infrastructure and the war machine is exactly the same as last year. Rick Spielman wasn't necessarily always the guy on the phone executing these trades. A lot of times it was Rob Brzezinski or Jamal Stevenson or Ryan Monens, and all those guys are still there. It's the same scouts. So to the extent that, Spielman set the tone from the top, that might be a little different, but at the same time, I still expect the draft day board, the wheeling and dealing, I think a lot of that will still be the same, because I think they have a lot of the same guys who would be making those trades, working the phones, part of the organization as well. So I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be that different. And that's also comports with the fact that I think the general and what Rick Spielman for all his faults, I think the analytics recommendation to the draft would be trade down, especially early. Trade up would advise against it unless it's for a quarterback. Spielman did trade up for the one, Teddy Bridgewater when he took him in the first round back in 2014. Otherwise, and you can trade up for skilled players, but you just have to be very confident that he's a clear tier above the next best skilled player at that position, which happens sometimes. If there's a Harrison Smith or if there's a Dalvin Cook worth trading up for, yeah, go for it. All that's just to say I don't expect the draft strategy to be that different. Maybe we won't be accumulating 32 seventh rounders this year, but otherwise I think a lot of the same strategy tactics will look the same.
Yeah, absolutely. So, flipping to the next one, I guess one of the strategies or one of the thought processes that go into when you're making a premium pick like the 12th overall pick is about positional value, right? Because positional value matters in a couple of instances, particularly with first round picks. With early first round picks, one of the things that you get, and one of the things people talk about all the time with quarterbacks specifically, is that you save money compared to a veteran quarterback with a quarterback on a rookie deal, right? That logic also applies to other positions. For example, when, Leonard Fournette was going as the number 4 overall pick, or when Ezekiel Elliott was going as the number 4 overall pick, they were immediately top 5 paid running backs at their position in those instances, right? So there's a bit of a trade-off where if you're taking non-premium positions or positions that don't get paid a lot with those high picks, you're losing surplus value on rookie deals even if they pan out, you're still paying them like a high paid player. Whereas if you get a player at a more important position, and we've seen wide receiver, for example, the market explode recently, Justin Jefferson's a fantastic deal for a wide receiver. Even an early first round pick, a Jamar Chase is a fantastic deal for a wide receiver of his caliber, right? In terms of the level of play. So, do you think that the Vikings would have any restrictions in terms of positions they're willing to take at 12, and what positions are they?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think every team does, whether you like it or not, because nobody is taking the best punter, the best kicker in the draft in the first round just because that they're just not going to be that valuable. That's also true, Quentin Nelson, as good as he was, or Saquon Barkley, as good as he was, probably one of the best running back to come out of college in, I hate to say generation, but in probably a decade, as good as they are, you're just not going to get as much surplus value drafting a position like that compared to the positions get paid the most, like left tackles, like edge defenders, like now wide receivers, and of course like quarterbacks. So part of that conversation is also need, though. Right now, Kirk Cousins is the quarterback. They could probably draft a quarterback of the future if they want. It wouldn't shock me. It would surprise me, but it wouldn't shock me. They could draft a wide receiver if one of the top guys fell to them, and I wouldn't necessarily hate it. This is also a team that drafted Randy Moss when they had Chris Carter and Jake Reed coming off 1,000-yard seasons. So need doesn't necessarily have to come to the equation. That's also the fact that while I'm high on KJ Osborne, and I've seen interesting flashes from Amir Smith-Marset, Adam Thielen is 32. He's not getting any younger, so some succession planning is probably a good idea as well. So I wouldn't necessarily put those positions off the board. I think cornerback is kind of still, even though we've talked about how big of a signing Patrick Peterson is, how it's great to get somebody like Shandon Sullivan, who's played 2,000 plus snaps at slot cornerback for the Packers over the last few years. As good as those signings are, it's important to probably beef up that room. One, Patrick Peterson is 31. Shannon Sullivan is a marginal role player. He's probably not ideally your starting nickel day one. Cam Dantzler can't stay healthy all year, and after that, the next guy up is Chris Boyd, Harrison Hands. So I still think cornerback, they're kind of penciled into. They're kind of in a little bit of a corner, having to find early help at cornerback. But I also don't think they need to necessarily reach for a cornerback at the same time. So I don't expect, where this comes to play, I think, in the first round is I don't expect them to draft a guard early, just because that's not the analytically sound thing, even though it's a need. They're kind of taking the Brandon Beane approach of just bring in a bunch of cheap guys and see who wins the job, and hopefully one of them can give you average level play at guard. That's kind of been the approach so far with the guys they've brought in. There are a few positions I don't expect them to take just because of the depth at the position, like tackle or defensive tackle. I'm not sure they necessarily need a guy there. I don't see those as team needs right now. I don't know. Are there any positions that you like would just write off as the Vikings aren't interested here in the first round in these guys because of the position they play?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, running back is the big one. I think you can take a tight end that early. I don't know how much that really pays off, unless it's a true no brainer. And obviously, in this draft, there aren't really any tight ends that achieve that status. For defensive tackle, like you just mentioned, I think because of the depth at the position and the signings that we've made and the resources we've allocated, it doesn't make any sense to me to draft a defensive tackle there. Or at least, I know we talked about this a bit on the last podcast, and I don't want to belabor it, but it doesn't make any sense to me to draft Jordan Davis, who profiles as, more of maybe just a more explosive Dalvin Tomlinson. Obviously, he's like massive and a freaky athlete, right? So that's something, but he's not going to be an Aaron Donald like game wrecker who destroys everything on every single down. Because of his size, leads to some playtime limitations, I think, there. So he's somebody who's off my board personally. But a linebacker as well in the first round is something I would avoid. Off-ball linebacker just, first of all, doesn't have value in this system like it does in maybe other systems, even as it did in Mike Zimmer's scheme. I think we leverage the linebackers more in Mike Zimmer's scheme. And that doesn't mean that Eric Kendricks isn't like an excellent system fit, right? It doesn't mean we should trade Eric Kendricks, but we also shouldn't be investing a first-round pick in a linebacker in this draft. So to me, I agree with you. I think they've pretty much pigeonholed themselves into corner, which is a little bit frustrating, but based on the cap situation that they had, not all too surprising, right? Because we added some guys who I think we can play, and we added one sure starter to me in Patrick Peterson, or retained one sure starter. But the room simply needed more work because of the failure of the previous regime to develop corners or get an adequate corner room. Right. And there's a lot of reasons for that we don't have to go into right now. Like, I don't think it's all Mike Zimmer's fault or something like that. But, the fact of the matter is the Vikings don't have corners who can play football. So we need to do something about that.
Yeah, their one big signing was Zadarius Smith. And I think that's probably the right approach to sign a bunch of bargain bin guys for the cornerback room because, it's a weak, cornerback is a weak link system. So if you sign, the best cornerback on the market but you still have Chandon Sullivan or Harrison Hand out there, that doesn't help you as much. Whereas one edge rusher, one pass rusher is all it takes to win, and that helps all your cornerbacks. So in a way, signing Zadarius Smith gives a boost to every single cornerback back there. So I like the way they approach that. I still think they could go edge if they needed to, because Hunter and Zadarius Smith are both probably, they're not old yet, but they will be old soon. So, and they're both, there's injury question marks about both. So like an edge at 12 is, I don't think, out of play, but I do think when you look at this roster, both right now and 2023, 2024, I think cornerback is the number one need on the roster. Still, even after they've done a good job addressing it with who they've brought in.
Yeah, and I would say if you don't go a corner at 12 because like 4 guys are off the board at that point, you pretty much have to go corner at 46 is their second round pick, and then even dip again with a third or fourth round pick. We traded our 4th round pick for Chris Herndon, didn't we? So we don't have that, which is great. But but you know what I mean? Like, there needs to be another significant draft investment in a corner, or another move to get a corner if you don't take one in the first round, right? I think we should probably take 2 coming out of this draft anyway, but especially if we don't take one in the first round.
Yeah, and talking this draft specifically, I really like the first 5 or so cornerbacks in this draft. I'm not sure you get day one starters beyond that. And I'm pretty sure the number 5 corner in the draft is going to go, early second round at the earliest. So my concern with skipping out on a cornerback at 12 is that, Chandon Sullivan, Pat Peterson, and Skinny Cam Dantzler, who's not going to hold up for 17 games. That's it for, those are your starting cornerbacks for the entire 2022 season. And that gets me a little bit concerned because I'm not sure that's a winning cornerback room. Compared especially to there's going to be some phenomenal edge players available at 12 that'll be really hard to turn down. And sometimes it makes sense to invest in just because somebody's like the fourth best edge player in the draft doesn't mean they're not going to be a Pro Bowler. Like sometimes you just have like really good draft classes, and sometimes you should just take the best player available. So I wouldn't hate it, but at the same time, there's going to be really good edge players, I think, in the second round, in the third round, maybe even the fourth round too. It's just a phenomenally deep edge class. So, and I don't think you can say the same. I think this cornerback class is a little more top heavy. So that also comes into play into how they're thinking about navigating the board and what they do at 12 and whether they trade down or whether they trade up out of the second round. So all those things I think come into play.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's roll it in to the final topic we have here, just as a general draft overview before we get into the cornerback room. And that would be, positional profiles or athletic profiles, whether that's player age, player measurements or player testing, or even player stats, from college stats that you think are important and you would like to see, the Vikings kind of implement in terms of thresholds.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I probably need to take a closer look at like what the Browns have done the last couple drafts. I don't think from
one interesting thing the Browns have done is they've only drafted they haven't drafted a 23 or a 24-year-old in the draft. So it's only been younger players.
So, and all five of the corners we're going to talk about today are all really young. So that, fits. But yeah, they need to be young. I will say for Donatell's scheme, talking corners specifically, like the length is nice, but like I said, they don't need to be pressing, so the length is not as important. Length that matters most at the catch point, obviously in the end zone, and then when you're pressing, because it's just like a matter of leverage. Same way length matters so much for edge defenders. It's like it's about reach. So it matters obviously, but for a Donatel scheme where you're playing so much quarters and off coverage and not necessarily like press man, cover one type pure man situations, I think it matters a little bit less. I don't know. I think the hip fluidity and the ability, like being smart in coverage, probably gets a premium in this scheme and what the Browns or what the Vikings are going to want to do with their cornerbacks. So, we could talk about all the other, athletic profiles and what things matter. I think people look a lot at the 40 times for athletes, but I think the agility drills probably might be the most important ones to pay attention to. That's kind of like what makes. Take Derek Stingley, for example. What makes him so special as a prospect isn't, obviously he's super fast and that matters. But the agility matters so much more, I think, for cornerbacks. So it all kind of comes into play, but it has to measure up to the tape. And it's hard to say if Kwesi has any particular like cutoffs. Like, is Trent McDuffie too short? Is Khairi Elam like too stiff? How do the health medicals check out for these guys? Like it's hard to say because he hasn't been GM for a draft yet. So will be interesting to find out if any of these guys necessarily don't fall into the thresholds, because we're starting all over. Whereas before with Spielman we had a decade's worth of data. Now we're starting all over again. So we'll see.
Yeah. It'll be really interesting to see how it turns out. And I think one of the things I want to pull from that is, particularly when you're looking at athletic profiles, 40 time matters, right? Like, people have to be on a threshold. And that actually, threshold is another key word, right? It's not necessarily everybody has to be an uber athlete who's perfect in all forms, right? I think it's people have to surpass certain thresholds. And for me, a lot of times with guys, I look at agility drills, specifically 3-cone, short shuttle also matters, and depending jumps. Right. So like for edge rusher, you kind of have a couple of different archetypes, right? There's the bursty, explosive edge rusher who wins with power. And those are guys you want to see have good jumps, right? So your Zadarius Smith had really good his athletic profile was not great. His best athletic trait were his jumps, right? In that profile. And that fits with how he plays. You have guys who are extremely bendy. Think Von Miller. Now, Von Miller's like a freak athlete, but I'm trying to think of an extremely bendy guy who's not like just a freak athlete. But, you have guys who are very bendy, who have the great 3-cone. Actually, the Bosas had not great jumps, not great 40 times, fantastic 3-cones, if you look it up. They might have had pretty good jumps, but like their 3-cones were out of this world. Right, their bendy, their agility was really out of this world, And then you have like the pure athletic freaks like Danielle Hunter are good at everything, right? And Brian Burns, and the list goes on and on and on. Like edge rusher, I think you need to be an athletic freak for me to want to draft you. You need to have great scores in any one of those categories. Corner, it's more about thresholds. It's more about, is the guy fast enough? Does the guy have the requisite movement skills? Does the guy have the requisite arm length? Which is a discussion that we're going to have because, oh boy, do some of these corners in this draft have short arms. Trent McDuffie is the one that gets talked about. There are two other names of the 5 that are below what I would consider the 31-inch threshold. So that'll be a really interesting conversation. And then outside of that, there's one thing that we don't talk about, and one thing that we're not privy to, which is a problem, is the mental makeup of all of these players, right? They do psychological profiling on every single one of these players. That's kind of I don't really know how it works, but it's something teams have on these players in terms of psychological profiles, who they are as people, and they work with psychologists to kind of help determine who is going to be, the top competitor, work the hardest, whatever, all that fun stuff that we're not privy to. And, that's an analytical part of it. And Rick Spielman actually has talked about this, kind of the analytical profile, like that personality profile plays a big part in this. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with Kwesi as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think one of the things I always keep in mind, like, there are certain positions where athleticism is both necessary and sufficient to be good in the NFL, and I think edge is the number one example. There are very few good edge rushers in the NFL who aren't special body types, special athletes, special unique looking players. I mean, just look at Danielle Hunter. He's like a freak. He's like a Greek god. His arms go all the way down to his knees. He's just like they don't make guys like that very often, so they're very hard to find guys like that. Whereas with wide receiver, it can take all types, and it's interesting. Like, it obviously, it's fun to have a wide receiver who's very fast, but there are slow wide receivers who can win with their routes, or can win at the catch point, or can win in all other different ways. So there are some positions where the testing scores matter a lot more, just because, like to be a left tackle or a right tackle in the NFL, you have to be long enough. To win at edge, you have to be long enough, and you have to be explosive enough, and you have to be bendy enough, and you have to be have to be a lot of things.
Yep.
Cornerbacks, because it's a defending position rather than an attacking position, they have to be fast enough to deal with speedsters so that they're not completely exposed, and they have to be agile enough to deal with shifty underneath route runners, and they have to be long enough to deal with the 6'4" wide receivers of the world. So that's I think their contracts and how much these guys get paid get reflected in that, because there are only so many, like 6'2" guys who run a 4.4 40 and can turn their hips on a dime in the world. So like these cornerbacks are pretty rare body types as well, in addition to these left tackles with who dancing bears, and these edge defenders who are just all world athletes. So I think that comes into play a little bit when you look at their contracts as well. So that's also a reason why I think these guys get prioritized in their premium positions in the NFL, not just because like cornerbacks, wide receivers, left tackles, right tackles, edge defenders win games. They also they take unique body types in a way that guards, centers, defensive tackles, linebackers don't necessarily. Safeties don't. So that's kind of an interesting thing to pay attention to when we're talking about all these testing numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we've teased long enough, right? Why don't we jump into our cornerback conversation here? You and I both watched the tape, found some all-22, sifted through it, tried to figure out what we could do to see from these guys. The 5 guys we have, and this is the order we'll go in through them, are Sauce Gardner, Derek Stingley Jr., Andrew Booth Jr. from Clemson. Sauce Gardner's from Cincinnati. Derek Stingley's from LSU. I think if you're a Vikings fan, you're very familiar with both of those names just from the conversation online. Andrew Booth Jr. from Clemson, Kaiir Elam from Florida, and Trent McDuffie, another name you are probably all familiar with, from Washington. Actually, I flipped Elam and McDuffie. We'll do McDuffie before Elam. But let's start out with Sauce Gardner. He is pretty much the consensus number 1 from analysts at this point, and we can go through and rank him at the bottom of this, but I would say that he is the corner that I have the least questions about going into this process. I think everything he is a pretty clear watch from the tape. One of the notes I have is I think he's pretty much Richard Sherman. Maybe a skinny Richard Sherman, but like you mentioned, like you teased a bit earlier, like he is a press man corner. He's tall, he's long, he's got great length, he uses it effectively. He actually has really good long speed. There were a couple plays where he's a smooth athlete, able to carry players across the field on crossing routes, which is something a couple of these other guys have struggled with. People talk about level of competition with him, but actually I think he had the third best level of competition. The two SEC guys are above him, but like he played Alabama in the national championship game. He had reps against Jameson Williams, who's going to be a first round pick. He played Notre Dame, which had Kevin Austin Jr., who is, at the combine and one of the better receivers in the NCAA last year. He might not be like a future star NFL receiver. He played Ty Freifogel from Indiana, who is a better receiver than pretty much anybody McDuffie or Andrew Booth played, is the thing. So, he played decent to good level competition, to the highest level of competition, and also a number of decent players at the college level who are going to be NFL prospects. So I'm not too concerned about his NFL, competition and seeing him against those guys, because he did play and he played well against those guys. Press, I think he's good. He's got a variety of techniques. He can get his hands on guys. He can also do it without getting his hands on guys, which I think is an important part of playing press and something that's underrated. There were a couple instances where he followed players in the slot, and he actually shows pretty impressive quickness for his size. He doesn't show great quickness. So there were times where he got on a comeback after kind of multiple stems, or he just doesn't quite get around and get to plays immediately. But again, talking about him in that cover 3 kind of mold, I don't think you need to ask him to do that perfectly. Sorry, I'm going long here, but, I thought he had great zone skills in terms of being able to read out patterns that were happening in front of him. I was probably most impressed with him. Maybe McDuffie was more impressive reading patterns, but, he was the most impressive to me of the guys in terms of reading the patterns in zone and actually getting to the spots and getting to the players that he was going to cover. And I think in terms of ball skills, he's got great length and he uses it. There was one play, I called it, he just dunked on a guy. Like, literally, he threw the guy, he didn't throw the guy to the ground, but he slammed the ball to the ground and the guy fell down like he was posterized, basically. It was kind of funny. And I would say that one of the biggest negatives I have for him is actually, like, he's not super active in the run game to me, and he also doesn't have great play strength for his size and length. Like, he gets knocked back by receivers blocking him pretty often in the run game, which, run game is somewhat of a minor part of corner play, but that's probably the biggest negative I had for him, honestly.
Yeah, he's skinny. Trent McDuffie weighs more than him.
Yeah.
It's like 4 inches shorter than him, 5 inches shorter than him. So he's skinny. It's hard to nitpick his game. I think you said it best by saying he's just like a very clean I flipped on his first game and I was like, there's very little to criticize here. He's just like a very clean evaluation. He's tall, he's long. That's obviously the first thing you notice is, man, does he have like long pterodactyl arms, and like, especially with the gloves on, he's just like, man, he's got a huge reach.
The other funny thing about Cincinnati is they have Kobe Bryant, who's also like 6'2" on the other side of the field, and he wears 7. So it was kind of hard because Sauce wears 1, and it's like, which guy am I watching sometimes? But one other note, Sauce played boundary corner, which we've mentioned before. He was pretty much exclusively boundary corner. That's pretty relevant to the Vikings.
Yeah, so you comp him to Richard Sherman, but he's even like faster than Richard Sherman. Yeah. He's more agile, I think, than Richard Sherman. So obviously he will need to learn. His technique will need to get cleaned up a fair amount, and he'll need to learn to have Richard Sherman's instincts if he wants to have a similar kind of all-pro career. But man, if I had to pick one guy who will just start and be a plus starter from day one, it's Sauce Gardner. He's just a very complete evaluation in terms of like nitpicking. He's skinny, and that you worry not just about how is he going to handle the run game, how is he going to handle bigger bodied receivers, but also how is he going to hold up for a 17-game season now. That worries me a little bit. He's a little tight or just sort of like upright. He doesn't sink down into his hips as much as others, and part of that is just because he's so tall, but also like there are guys who almost squat when they're ready to press, and that's not Gardner's game as much. It's just not as doesn't have that same kind of agility. And But that's kind of how taller cornerbacks have to go. The taller you get, the less fluid you're going to be with your hips and stuff. And if you're using him as a press guy, primarily, that I don't think you have to worry about that as much. The Vikings, I think he's not as great of a fit. I think he's kind of a perfect fit for a team that wants to do a lot of cover one, cover three, all these Seattle, Pete Carroll cover three type schemes. He's kind of like the ideal fit for that, just because the comparisons he's going to get to those kinds of corners, and the length that he brings. I wasn't blown away by his run defense. It wasn't bad, but I thought there were times he could have been more active or triggered downhill more quickly or gotten into his fit a little faster. He's grabby, and I think that's going to lead to more penalties at the NFL. It did lead to penalties at the college level. Interference, holding. That's kind of his game. He likes to push guys around and bully them, and if it's a fade route, he loves to smother guys out of bounds, and he loves to just sort of give hard jams, and he's good at it too. For as violent and physical as his jamming technique is, he's also very patient. But like I said, not a lot to nitpick. He's got a good back pedal. For a taller cornerback, he moves well. His hips are good. His instincts are good in zone. I don't think it'd be a waste for the Vikings to pick him. If I had my pick of any of the guys, it would probably be Gardner. Even though I think he'd be better and he'd be even better in another scheme. I think he can do off coverage. He can play zone. He's got good ball skills. He's got good instincts for it. He's pretty explosive, and he's pretty quick to read the quarterback's eyes. So he's just a very good, solid all around cornerback. He doesn't necessarily have the fluidity and the agility to be like the next Deion Sanders or have the highest of ceilings, but I think he's going to be a good starter from year one. So just like you said, a very clean prospect. It's easy to rank him first because it's hard to nitpick and criticize his game.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pull out from a Vikings fit, I agree with you that maybe, our scheme isn't the best fit for him, but I think he fits well in our scheme, right? If you put him at that boundary corner, which field boundary is a lot bigger of a difference in college football where the hashes are wider. And just to clarify, in case people don't know, the boundary is the short side of the field. So if they're on the left hash, the left side is the boundary. That's the shorter side. Whereas the field, it's more open, is the other side. And that's typically where you would have three receivers or something. So Sauce Gardner is your single cornerback on the backside of the formation. And in our system, you ask that guy to play man a lot. So I think his man skills, and particularly his prowess carrying guys on crossing routes across the field, which is one of the most difficult things a corner is asked to do. Sauce did that incredibly well. And then also, the route tree, if you're playing cover 4 or, the cover 6 variation, is kind of similar to a cover 3 play where you have to play outside and deep, right? Man outside and deep. That's playing the vertical tree and the vertical routes. And you're not asked to have that fluidity as much in those situations. So I think it does translate pretty well. And, just one more thing on the grabby point, I do agree that he's a little grabby, but I think that's also kind of nitpicky because he's not really grabby. For Vikings fans, I think the good Xavier Rhodes is kind of the level of grabby he is, right? Where bad Xavier Rhodes was very, very grabby, right? And ended up getting a lot of penalties. Sauce is going to get some penalties from being overly physical, but I don't think he's going to be a penalty machine.
I don't think he's quick to initiate contact. A lot of the times it's he's patient. He's really patient when he's in press and he's backpedaling, and he won't necessarily be the first to throw the punch. If he is, it's when he's planning to, and when he's not, it's he'll just sort of punch back and he'll fight throughout the route, and that'll continue, downfield. I do think that style of play will lead to some penalties. You have to be very careful about it. It's a point of emphasis, but it's not I don't want to it's not some huge red flag, and he wasn't a penalty machine in college. I don't think he will be in the NFL. I just think it's something that, that's kind of his play style. So
yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to the next one. Do you want to lead us off on Derek Stingley Jr., LSU?
Yeah, Stingley. The guy who's gotten probably the most attention from Vikings fans. He was had one of these sort of all-world freshman seasons at LSU as a true freshman, came out and just sort of played out of this world. Recorded 6 interceptions, had a ton of pass breakups. Was covering, going up against the best of the best, and really showing out. Was incredible at the catch point. he's got some of the most tremendous traits of any quarterback to come out, I think, in recent history. His feet in particular are just out of this world, especially for a taller cornerback. He's 6 foot, but he's got the feet of like a 5'7" slot cornerback, just like
Mm-hmm.
very, very quick, special feet. You kind of have to watch him, just like turn on one of his games and just like watch how lightning quick his feet are. He's got very fluid hips too. He'll sort of flip on a dime, and he's very comfortable from a back pedal or from like a shuffle step. He can speed turn, zone turn. It's like he's just such an easy mover, and that unlocks so many things for him as like a pure shut down, put him on a guy one on one, and just set it and forget it. He's going to be, or he has the traits to be kind of a very, very high ceiling, like Deion Sanders, like I'm going to just put me on their best guy and I'm just going to lock them down. So, all that said, that was the promise of Derek Stingley coming out of his freshman year at LSU, but then the next 2 years happened, and he got injured between his foot and the hamstring and all these other things to crop up. He didn't quite it didn't put up the ball production. He hadn't had an interception in 2020 or 2021, so that kind of went away. And then the injury history came into play. And now there's questions. He has a lot of question marks about him.
Yeah.
And I will say, when I went back and watched all his 2019 games, I was a little unimpressed, because I shouldn't say unimpressed, but the word for me is he's boomer bust. He's very
Sure.
boomer bust because he had a lot of phenomenal, like, holy smokes, this is an incredible highlight reel play. But he also had his lows were the worst of any of these five cornerbacks, I think. He got absolutely embarrassed by Devonta Smith. In the two games he played against Devonta Smith in Bama in 2019 and in 2020, gave up 500 yards and 5 touchdowns over 2 games. So not all of that was like entirely his fault, but there were also plays where I think he got caught with his pants down that he wasn't targeted to. So overall, just a very, very bad day against Bama. And that's tough when he's going up against competition like that. At the same time, he also had plays where he was like pressing Kyle Pitts on a fade route out of bounds, or he went up against a lot of good competition, as he would, as an LSU corner. He's man, it's a lot of thoughts here. He's long, he's tall, if he hits, he's got every trait in the world to be like a Jalen Ramsey shutdown number one corner. But he's got all sorts of question marks, not just the injury history and can he recover from them. Obviously, at his pro day, we're recording on Wednesday when LSU just had its pro day, and his testing numbers were good. Everybody saw like the 4.37 40, but at the same time, his agility numbers were actually a lot worse than I would.
Did he run agilities? I didn't see that. I looked for that and I didn't see him reported.
Yeah, he did. Brugler tweeted out the short shuttle and the 3-cone, and they were not as good. Like, they were like 60th percentile, which is like, that's good, especially for a guy who's 6 feet tall. But at the same time, like, you watch his tape, especially his freshman tape, and man, he's just a very, very special mover. So he's a very good upside player, but there's also a lot of reasons to be worried about how much of this will translate to the NFL. How much of this are we also overlooking all the bad with his play? What about the injury concerns? What about everything else? Why didn't he take the next step forward after such a phenomenal 2019 season? The other wrinkle here for the Vikings specifically is Durante Jones is now their DB's coach again, and he was Derek Stingley's DB's coach or defensive coordinator at LSU. So it's a funny situation where I think you said this, Matt, where like if the Vikings take him at 12, I'll be thrilled because it means that we've got the sign off there. And if they pass on him at 12, I will completely understand it because it means they knew something we didn't about his health situation or his character or something else in the background there. So it really, really interesting evaluation. I probably clipped over 50 plays over like the 15, 20 games of Stingley's that I watched. So I have a lot of thoughts about Stingley, and it's hard to put them into just one segment. But I've talked about your ear off, so I'll let you jump in and let me know what do you think about Stingley?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually need to tweet that take instead of just sending him in the DMs. I think that's a good take. But so the first note I have for Stingley is that he's a rare mover with elite athleticism, or at least elite on-field athleticism based on what you see on the tape. So with him, I mean, you mentioned it, just his foot quickness and his ability he moves at a different speed than everybody else on the field, or maybe not everybody else on the field, but he moves at a different speed than almost anybody else on the field, and he's playing with a ton of first round picks. Right. It's like, and this is as a true freshman, as an 18 or 19-year-old going up against the best players in the country. And I think that's something that we have to understand in context with his 2019 tape. Right. If you look at him, the way he moves reminds me of, I think the best way to describe this is if you watch some of the on-field drills at the combine. Particularly, I think it's most notable with edge rushers, because if you look at a guy, if you just watch whatever your Brian Burns was, watch all of the guys and then watch Brian Burns, and you can see his fluidity and his movement is different from everybody else on the field there. That's the vibe you get with Derek Stingley when you're watching his tape at LSU. I think he's a special mover, and I think that trait didn't necessarily go away. I remember watching UCLA this year, and I think you still saw those movement skills. I did just look it up because you had mentioned it. He did have a sub 7.3 cone. It was 6.98 and a 4.19 short shuttle, which, as you said, good, not great numbers for a cornerback. He also, is coming off of foot surgery not so long ago. I don't know how much that. Now, if that has permanently impacted his athleticism, that's kind of a question mark, right? If that has temporarily impacted his athleticism and his numbers are still good enough that he wanted to do the testing at the pro day and prove that he was still a good player, then that's fine by me, right? And that's something that maybe we find out more with Durante Jones on the staff, right? If the Vikings take him at 12, that means Durante Jones feels great about having Derek Stingley on the team. If he's on the board at 12 and the Vikings don't take him, that means Durante Jones was not pounding the table for Derek Stingley, which is a big question mark to me, right? So that's one. I think the ball skills are elite. Like, these are some of the best ball skills I've seen from any corner. If you look, I mean, some of the interceptions he makes are just ridiculous in that 2019 tape.
Crazy.
It's just absolutely crazy. And I don't think that's a skill that goes away from a player or a player loses over time. I think it's more of a matter of opportunity and maybe potentially being hindered by injuries in the 2020 season. To be honest, I didn't watch much of the 2020 season. It was 2019 and the one UCLA game we have in 2021 from him for me. So one of the things is, I think, particularly in 2019, the technique isn't always there. You see him lose in press, and that was one big touchdown to Devontae Smith. Against Devontae Smith, honestly, in that 2019 Alabama game, he lost one big touchdown. There were a couple of ridiculous catches that Devontae Smith made, right? Like, through contact from Stingley, just really tough catches that a top 10 wide receiver ended up making. And then there were another couple plays where he beat him with good route running. But I think something you have to keep in context is I talked about how the competition for Sauce Gardner was pretty good, right? And you see that with Jameson Williams from Alabama. But the second best player he played is going to be like a third or fourth round pick in Kevin Austin from Notre Dame. If you look at Derek Stingley in that first season, he played Georgia, who had George Pickens at the time. Right. And that was when George Pickens burst onto the team as a freshman. He played Alabama, who had Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, and Henry Ruggs on that same team. Right. That's 4 first round picks on the same team. Now, he was mostly up against Devontae Smith 2 years in a row. Right. But still. And they had John Mechie on that team still, too. Florida, who had Kyle Pitts and Van Jefferson, who was a second round pick and is been solid in the league, right? That's the highest level of competition. Playing Ole Miss, they had Elijah Moore. So it's a really high level of competition that he faced, and I think that is a big context for me when he's going up as a true freshman against these guys. And Devontae Smith was a senior, so he was draft eligible the year that he went up against him in 2019. I think I would credit him with some development there. Now, that brings us back to the question of where did the development go, right? And the LSU program kind of fell apart. Dave Aranda left after 2019. He got the head coaching job at Baylor, so that makes a difference. The whole Ed Ogeron saga, now he's out there. So I think there are reasonable explanations for why the performance did not improve after that year that maybe get unlocked at the NFL level. But, we don't know the full story, so those questions are kind of looming. One last thing I want to say on him is I kind of see him and Sauce in a similar level in terms of how they play run defense and their play strength. Like, I don't think it's great for either of them, but I think they're on a similar level. Like, I see Derek Stingley get dogged for his run defense online sometimes, where you have scouts who say like, oh, he doesn't really try or doesn't care. I think you could say the same stuff about Sauce Gardner. So like, miss me with the Derek Stingley run defense thing. I think it's fine, even if it's not like great.
Yeah, it's not bad. And I have zero questions about his effort. I just think, you know, there are instances where, he's got some poor tackling attempts. He doesn't wrap up, or the dog pile comes to him and it falls in front of his feet, and he just says, like, no, I'm not going to risk it in another injury. I'll just stand and look at this one, which is, I'm not terribly worried about that kind of stuff. One other thing, I think the two things that are really elite traits that flash for him are the movement skills, the speed, the easy speed. Man, does he just like explode when it's his turn to like just run and go. He just blinks out upfield, and he doesn't get beat vertically at all, like ever. So it's I think part of that is that vertical speed gives him such incredible confidence when he's in front, when a receiver is in front of him. He's so incredibly patient from press. And he'll just like spend all day, let the guy take all day to declare, and then that's when if they get past him and it's his time to like catch up, or if somebody gets past him, or if he gets beat, he just has such easy speed to like turn his hips on a swivel and burst upfield and catch up to him. So just very, very special, like that movement skills, and that's kind of how it plays out, and that makes him a unique fit, I think, for this cover one system, where like this cover four system, where if somebody, you kind of, that's your number one responsibility is to cover the vertical route tree. Obviously the hip fluidity helps a lot if he's carrying guys, horizontally across the field, or for shiftier guys who are, hitting him with like a whip route or pivot or something. So those things come across, I think, but like also just the patience in his back pedal, and the ball skills. Those are the things that all really stand out to me. I do think, at least as a freshman, he got beat inside a little too often, whether it was post routes or slant routes, or like over routes. He kind of like opened his hips or opened the gate a little bit early, and guys beat him pretty regularly inside. He didn't really get beat vertically or outside, but he did kind of give it up a little easily. And while he is tall enough and long enough, I guess he's got like 31-inch arms, I think, or
it's 34, 30 and 5/8, so below that 31-inch threshold.
Good enough to get by. But like if a guy established, like Kyle Pitts, for example, when Kyle Pitts like established leverage against him, I remember on a post route, he's not going to be able to disrupt that at the catch point if the ball is placed accurately. So stuff like that. I will say he seemed to improve on that in his later couple of years, and I'll also say like, the freshman tape had the most special moments, but he also just wasn't targeted very much in the next 2 years. And so, of course, like, he didn't have many more interceptions when guys weren't picking on him as much, because now at that point he had arrived and people knew he was Derek Stingley and he was wearing the number 7 to signify like, yeah, this dude is a dog. So I think those concerns are a little overblown. I'm not saying there's nothing there, that is like his 2020, 2021 tape is like good, secretly even better, but I also think it's a little overblown a little bit. So, man, just like a very interesting prospect. Compared to Sauce Gardner, who's just like such a boring eval, like people don't target him, people don't go after him. People went after Stingley a lot for usually very bad results. So, a lot of interesting question marks in that guy, and I could see him going anywhere. So, it will be very interesting to see if he falls to 12 and if he does what the Vikings do.
Yeah, and one last note there, and I agree with you on the leverage issues, letting up inside routes. Even this year, there was a game, he played 3 games. I should note, he played 15 games in 2019. He played 10 games over the past 2 seasons, right? So there's very much a difference in playtime, and he was injured on and off in that 2020 season where he tried to play through it. This year, after 3 games, he was shut down due to plantar fasciitis, I think, or maybe other issues as well. Leveraging issues, and then because of the leverage issues, that kind of leads to mental processing questions like, does he understand the route combinations that are possible when with the player that's going against him. So that'll be interesting to see. And that's not something you can really tell without talking to a player and talking through those kind of plays with them to see what went wrong there. Like the UCLA game, if he was expecting the safety to drive on any sort of crossing route in that situation, I don't blame him at all. He was playing outside leverage. But if he's not expecting the safety to drive in that defense, then that's a problem because he didn't play the leverage technique correctly, just as an example. So that's kind of the most interesting question to me. But like we said, special traits that make you want to take this guy high. So let's move on to Andrew Booth Jr. I think Andrew Booth, as a guy who's not being talked about, was a pleasant surprise for me in terms of he's a guy and we can get into this, I absolutely have no problem taking him at 12. But what were your thoughts on him?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually came to the exact same conclusion. He was easily the biggest pleasant surprise by how much I liked his tape. And I'm kind of shocked more Vikings fans aren't talking about Booth as a first round guy or a guy that you could take at 12 because a lot of the traits that we talk about Stingley, he's not quite on the elite level as Stingley's traits, but man, does he have good feet? Man, does he have fluid hips? Man, can he run? And he's got good size, good outside size as well, long enough arms. I forget the exact measurement.
He's over 6 foot, 190, 31 and a half or 31 inch on the dot arms. I forget one of the two.
Yeah, 31 and a half inch arms. So even longer than Stingley. So he checks so many boxes and his tape is great. His tape is really good. So, all those traits show up on film. I think he's, the Clemson kind of runs so many different varieties of coverages. It's a lot of deep spot drop type coverages, but also you see enough of him in press, you see enough of him in man situations that you can kind of evaluate Booth for his fit for every single different kind of play call, and he can do it all very well. He's a very versatile corner. Speaking of versatility, he's easily the best run defender of these five guys.
100%.
Man, does he get after it? He just violently destroys guys. I clipped out. I saw one game, and he just destroyed 3 screens.
Was that Georgia? It was Georgia because he killed 3 screens. So. Yeah,
he just obliterates guys, and he's not afraid of. There's a pulling guard. He'll take him head on and just push his way through. He'll demolish a tight end who comes out to block him, and I will say he misses tackles. His tackling form is not good. He doesn't wrap up, and he probably missed more tackles than any of these other 5 guys. So that's an easy knock to draw against him, but it's not for lack of effort. Man, does he like to get after it. So, he just checks so many boxes. He's a really good player. He's not out of this world traits, but I can see him starting day one and being an average to maybe even above average starter from day one. I don't necessarily think it would be a bad value to take him at 12 because he answers a lot of questions that I think other guys don't, both from his traits, his length, his versatility, the fact that I feel comfortable. He's patient in press. He's got good recovery speed if he's beat or if he needs to carry a fade route deep. He can play from trail. He can play from zone. He's got good instincts from zone. He's got good ball skills. He had this crazy interception where he drove from, I think it was a cover 2 drop or something, but it was a throw to the flat, and he just made a diving catch for the ball and came down with it. So good instincts, good explosiveness, good ball skills. It's funny. I feel like he's good at almost everything, and he's got some great traits as well. He's not quite elite traits, but he checks so many boxes, and I don't know. I would be very happy with him at 12. I would be over the moon if they traded down and were still able to get him too. Yeah. So I really liked his tape and was shockingly surprised at how much I ended up liking his tape. I understand why he's not as high as Sauce or Stingley just because his traits are not quite on those guys' levels. But man, I have a lot less questions about Booth than I do about Stingley. So will be interesting to see where he ultimately ends up going because I think he could be a really good player.
Yes. So for Booth, one quick note on him. He had core muscle surgery, so he hasn't done any athletic testing. But like you mentioned, I'm not really concerned about his athletic ability. I think that he is more than fast enough, more than quick enough, has the explosion, especially has the explosion. I think he has elite explosion and he has good speed and good quickness, especially for somebody of his size in terms of those abilities. the first note I have on him is just that effort in the run game. The explosion and the violence in the run game was really impressive to see. Like you said, he does miss tackles. I think he has a pretty high missed tackle rate per PFF. But honestly, it's a technique thing and not a want-to thing, so I don't really care about that too much. Like, I'd rather have my guy blow up screens and miss a tackle here and there a couple yards in the backfield and allow people to rally and tackle than not take on blocks violently or strong at all. I think he's got good play strength, unlike the other two corners that we just talked about in run defense. Like, he knocks wide receivers back, he bends wide receivers back when they're blocking him, and he's willing to take on larger players as well. So I think that's a positive for him compared to the other players. The first note I have is I love his press technique. I think he has great press technique without having to use his hands, which is a key to me. And this is something that actually there's a Richard Sherman video talking about it. If you use your hands in press, you open yourself up to losing badly, because if the wide receiver beats you with your hands, if you don't have good technique, it's about your feet really in press getting off there. Hands help, and hands help you shut down guys entirely, but the feet are the number one key, and he has great press technique with those feet. Second, like you said, he has, experience in a variety of systems. He's playing cover 3, he's playing cover 4, he's playing press man, he's playing off or catch man. And actually there was one rep in catch man against a comeback route, which was the death of Trey Waynes, if you remember, right? Trey Waynes playing off man, allowing short comebacks like all day automatically. And, this is something we saw last year playing off man. Cam Dantzler, the Cowboys game. Think about the Cowboys game, playing off man, allowing comebacks, both Dantzler and Breland in that situation. He played it great. He has a great feel for where routes break from wide receivers. I will say. So in terms of a system fit projection, I actually think he's the cleanest system fit projection for the Vikings, because he does everything, and you've seen him do everything in that. He does play, bail into deep quarters or deep, thirds a lot. One of the things I think he has a little bit of an issue with spacing in zone, in terms of he gets too much depth sometimes in those situations. There were a couple comebacks that he allowed that were really his responsibility in zone. But if he's playing man technique, I think he has a really good feel for where routes break. And he has a really good feel for where routes break deep down the field in that 12 to 15 yard range in terms of outbreakers or deep comebacks or posts or in-breaking routes. One thing I will say I noticed with him is, unlike Sauce Gardner, I did see him get run away from a couple times on crossing routes, which is a man coverage that you ask guys to do, and he might be asked to do with the Vikings. So I don't think he has quite the same speed that Sauce does. Like, I think he has very good speed, and I think he has enough speed. You see him keep with the receivers deep on vertical routes on multiple occasions, but I don't think it's quite in the same tier as maybe Stingley or Sauce. And then the one final note I have on him is lack of competition. So he did not play really anybody good. They played Georgia this year. Georgia has George Pickens. George Pickens was not in that game. He was injured for most of the year and came back later in the year. If you look at the list of schools they played in the ACC, I just looked this up because I was curious. So there were only 4 ACC receivers invited to the combine. One was George Pickens. One was Justin Ross from Clemson. The other 2 were from Miami and Virginia Tech. Clemson didn't play Miami or Virginia Tech this year. None of the receivers he played were invited to the combine this year. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't play anybody. Pitt actually had the Blitnikoff winner, which is the best wide receiver in college football. That's Jordan Addison. I watched the Pitt game. Booth was matched up on Addison like once in the entire game. Right, so that's something that is a bit of a question to me, just in terms of the level of competition that he was playing. And I think that's something that's very relevant for corners, because, actually, who's the best wide receiver outside of us in the NFC North right now, Nick?
Other than Thielen and Jefferson?
Yeah.
I would probably say Mooney.
Yeah, so maybe it's not that much of a concern for the Vikings. No, Darnell Mooney's a pretty good player, but the level of competition you face in the NFL at wide receiver, you have elite guys on like a number of teams, right? There are so many good receivers in this league that it does leave a little bit of a lingering question. There were a couple other weird things with Booth. So the thing I noticed is a lot of times guys play sides. Derek Stingley specifically plays sides, or they play field boundary, where Sauce Gardner plays boundary, right? Andrew Booth played the Clemson sideline. It's weird because on all 22, he stays on the same, like he stays either away from you or close to you the entire time, no matter what direction the other team's going, and no matter where the ball is on the side of the field. So I wonder if that was a communication thing with Clemson where they trusted him to communicate, or a communication thing with Clemson where they did not trust him and they wanted him near the sideline to talk to him. So I'd be interesting to get to the bottom of that. In terms of ball skills, one note I had is just like, he's got fine ball skills. Like Derek Stingley has by far the best ball skills of any of these guys, and he is otherworldly. I think that Booth has good hand technique. I think Sauce maybe has better ball skills because of his length, which is extreme length. But I think that Booth's are acceptable, and he does have this one amazing interceptions that he got. So, he's good ball skills, but he's not going to be grabbing 8 picks a year or something like that, I think.
Yeah, I think that sums it up, and I think that's a fair reason for why a lot of guys probably are a little bit lower on him, between the long speed concerns, the competition concerns, and just not necessarily having the same level of trade. Although I will say, Stingley's of the world aside, I think he has like some of the best feet and some of the best explosiveness of anyone in this class, and it's just really special. The way he's really able to use any foot technique to sort of attack receivers, whether it's backpedal, whether it's a shuffle, whether it's slowly transitioning, a soft press, off coverage, being able to explode downhill from like deep off coverage. He's so good at it all. So just a very well-rounded cornerback who I think is going to be a good starter from the get-go, and a guy who I think would be a great fit for the Vikings, and probably the one that watching him, my own opinion of him rose the most. And I think you're right to point out that probably the reason he gets slept on a little bit is that he didn't test at the combine. But if you just watch his tape, I have zero concerns about his athletic profile. I mean, he's a 5-star athlete, so obviously he's a good player. But you can see like he's a very high caliber NFL. Even among NFL starters, I think he would be a plus athlete for the position. So he'd be a great player. I would have no qualms taking him at 12. Would love it if they could get him if they traded down. So I really like Booth.
Yeah, so let's move on from Booth to the next one, somebody who gets mocked to the Vikings a lot at 12, I think. Maybe less than Stingley, but, he's probably the second most common mock, is Trent McDuffie from Washington. One, just to get out of front of this, we both had limited access to tape on McDuffie. The only full game we had was the Oregon game from this past year. And then we also had like half of a Michigan game where the tape was kind of broken. So we got to watch like 20 plays of it. And then so for me, from watching him, it's kind of hard to give a complete evaluation. There were a couple snaps where he was in man coverage and press man coverage. He was able to carry guys vertically fine. I think he moves very well. I think you were just talking about Booth's fluidity. I think McDuffie is more fluid, but he also comes in a smaller package than Booth, right? So it's kind of a trade-off there. One thing that we talked about with Booth was his aggressiveness. I think McDuffie is also kind of a dog in the game. He plays aggressive against the run. He got absolutely blown up by a guard, but he ran face first into him, right? So, it's a trade-off with his, with his size, where he's not going to be able to take on blocks as effectively, although he's pretty compact. Like, he came in at 180, 193 or something like that, which is a pretty good weight for his size. But he is willing in run defense, so I think that's a plus for him. Outside of the great fluidity and movement skills, he plays a lot of zone coverage in that defense, so you don't get to see a lot of the man traits, but he does have, I would say, good explosion, good movement, and processes things well in zone. So anything you want to add on McDuffie there, Nick?
Yeah, like you said, wasn't able to watch as much tape of him as I wanted, but from the tape I saw, the traits really pop. He's a smaller corner, so that helps, but like even taking into account that he's a smaller corner, He's very, very fluid. He's very, very fast. He's very swivelly. He's kind of like checks all the traits, and he's very sticky, kind of like a gnat in coverage. You just like don't shake him very easily. He can press. You wouldn't necessarily think of that, being sub 5'11" and sub 30-inch arms, but he can press and he can do it well. He's got great instincts in coverage. I think he checks so many boxes, but it's just two glaring ones that he fails, and that's the arm length conversation or the general height conversation. Is he a boundary corner or not? And the competition question, probably part of the reason we couldn't get our hands on Washington tape is because they're just not as big of a school as LSU or Bama or Ohio State or whoever. So he wasn't necessarily going up against a lot of NFL caliber competition, but at the same time, the traits, I think, absolutely translate. He looks like a good starting NFL corner. He has versatility. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that this is a guy who I think can survive on the NFL on the boundary, but could also play inside at nickel. I think he'd be a very, very good NFL starting nickel. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think having a guy who can play both is versatile, and he was a punt returner too, so he brings some special teams value. Not that that's the reason, that probably shouldn't, special teams probably shouldn't be part of your evaluation at all in the first round, but it's a plus. So he's a very special mover, very special athlete. His length, the question of whether he can survive on the boundary. I mean, he did it in college, and he did it against some taller receivers in college too. So it's going to be a limitation for him in the red zone when the spaces are more constricted. And it's going to be a limitation for him against taller, 6'3", 6'4" receivers in the NFL that he'll be matched up against. But at the same time, the most important thing a corner can do is to be in phase and to be in the right place so that the quarterback doesn't see that guy is open. And that's what McDuffie does really well. He just doesn't get targeted a lot. He doesn't, get a lot of ball production because he's the guys he goes up against don't get open very often. And to the extent he does get picked on or does get targeted, being in phase is going to get you a lot closer to the football than having an extra inch on your arm is. So I acknowledge that these are serious limitations, and the history of guys who have, sub 30-inch arms surviving as a boundary corner in the NFL is like 5 dudes, and none of them are very good necessarily. It's just there's a lot of history weighing against it, but I also think part of that is just self-selection. I don't think it's necessarily that like guys with 29-inch arms got into the NFL and sucked, and it turned out they sucked because they had short arms. I think it's guys with arms that short normally don't necessarily make it to the NFL or kind of get pre-selected and put into other positions at the NFL, or maybe they get moved to safety or something. So I think McDuffie has the skills, the sort of Jair Alexander-like, Nat-like skills to sort of like be sticky, shut down in coverage. And I think he can make up for those lack of length concerns. The other thing I would say is he's 5'11", technically 5'10" and 3/4, but he's 5'11" in shoes, we'll call it. That's enough to be a boundary corner. It's not terrible. It's not, he's not like 5'8" or something. So 5'11", that's an inch shorter than 6 foot, and 6 foot is above average for a boundary corner. So there's some rounding on top of rounding there. But the point is, he'll be fine. It's a weakness, but it's not something that where like I think he's a nickel only. I think he can more than survive on the boundary. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So
is he a slot only?
So yeah, to me, honestly, he's a slot only, and I do have those length concerns on the boundary, and I think you raise a number of good points. Like, I think the being in phase is important. I think that's probably the most important. But I think there does become a limit where even if you're in phase, it becomes difficult for you to make plays on the ball when you have those short arms. So I have a couple things just in terms of arm length. So first of all, this is a particularly short arm class. I mentioned the 31-inch threshold for arm length. There are a number of guys in this draft that don't meet that. Roger McCreary had even shorter arms than McDuffie did. McDuffie came in at 29 3/4. McCreary was 29.5. You also have Kobe Bryant, who is tall with short arms. That's a really weird, it's a Cameron Dantzler frame. Derek Stingley came in at 30 5/8. So that's almost an inch longer than McDuffie, right? And we're talking about 31 being the threshold. McDuffie's more than an inch below that threshold. Zion McCollum, who's like a freak athlete, also came in low. Tariq Castro-Fields and Kaiir Elam, who we're going to talk about next, was 30 7/8. So all of those guys were over my 31-inch threshold. One thing I did is I went back and looked at the history of corners who have made the Pro Bowl or made an All-Pro team, whether it's a first or second All-Pro team, since 2010. There are 50 names on the list. 4 of them have sub 31-inch arms. 4 out of 50. 2 of them, I'm sorry, it's 6 out of 50. Only 2 of them have sub 30-inch arms. Their names are Antoine Winfield, senior, obviously, and Asante Samuel, also senior. Both sons play in the NFL. So, it's possible, but those guys are exceedingly rare. And Asante Samuel senior was an outside corner. So it is possible for Trent McDuffie. I'm not saying it's totally impossible. It's just not something I would bet on. And that's where you're spending that high value pick at 12. It's a concern to me. Couple other fun facts. The Vikings actually rostered a bunch of guys under the Zimmer era who had shorter arms. Like, they didn't seem to care about that threshold too much. They had Kendall James, Perry Nickerson, Mark Fields, Cameron Dantzler, obviously the needle, that's why he's so skinny, Cam Bynum, who obviously moved to safety, Chris Boyd, and Mike Hughes. So, we were willing to draft a guy in the first round. We were willing to do all that stuff. The other thing is, if you look at the history of highly drafted players with shorter arms, the list isn't all that impressive. So Elijah Molden was a 3rd-round pick last year. He played pretty well. Dante Jackson was a 2nd-round pick by the Panthers. And this is actually an order of arm length from low to high. So the earlier they are, the shorter arms these guys had. A lot of the ones towards the end of the list had like 30.5-inch arms. So again, almost a full inch longer than McDuffie. You had Kareem Jackson, who was in the Fangio-style defense last year. You had Damon Arnett, who's out of the league at this point for off-the-field reasons. Asante Samuel Jr., no surprise given his father's short arms that he doesn't have that long arms. Byron Murphy, another Washington guy. Darqueze Dennard, Patrick Robinson, Prince Amukamara, Dre Kirkpatrick, Jason Verrett, Vernon Hargraves, Chidobe Awuzie, Christian Fulton. So Derek Stingley's teammate at LSU. So you look at those names, and even as first-round picks, like, there are some good careers in there, but none of them are inspiring players. And that's kind of the concern for me, where if I'm drafting a corner at 12, I want to have an all-pro, Pro Bowl ceiling. You look at the names of those guys with those shorter arms, they're not really there. And I'm more flexible on a guy like Stingley, who's close to the threshold, right, than I am on a guy like McDuffie, who's very far below it.
Yeah, those are all great points. I guess, I don't know. Part of it is, correlation versus causation. And part of it is, the NFL has weird thresholds that don't always make sense. Like when Drew Brees came into the league, the theory was, you needed to be like 6'7" so that you could see over your offensive line. Yeah. And so guys like Drew Brees, Russell Wilson fell, and it turns out you can still read the field when you're 6 foot short. A lot of guys had these guys off their board because, they weren't tall enough. And it turns out like, an inch or two didn't actually make all the difference in the world. And I just sort of, I trust the tape a little bit more than the measurables. And I know that an inch matters, but the number of plays where 1 inch is the difference between a pass breakup and a completion is very, 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 very small. And I'm just not willing to write off a guy's career based on or say he can't stick it on the boundary just because of that one little thing. So while I understand the precedent isn't with him, I'm not sure that's necessarily because it'll affect how he plays in the NFL. It is a concern. It is a weakness. I would still stick him on the boundary and see how that goes. Do I see the value? No, because at 12, I have enough questions about the strength of competition and the arm length and the size on top of everything else that, he wouldn't be my first choice at 12. If they picked him and he ended up being a slot only, that would be bad value. Slots are very cheap in the NFL, and you can find them. And we just signed one for practically that minimum. It's not very good, but you can find guys like that. Even the good ones get signed for like, $7 million, $8 million a year. So it's just not for whatever reason, despite being a very, very difficult position to play because you're constantly defending two-way goes and you're always matched up against sometimes you're matched up against Tyreek Hill or a lot of good players. Stephon Diggs, put him in. Terry McLaurin, put him into the slot. So it's a hard position, but for some reason the NFL doesn't value him. It'll be a bad thing if he winds up being slot only. So all those reasons, I understand trepidation with picking him at 12. Although personally, I wouldn't hate it if that's not the way that the Vikings went. So we'll see
Yeah.
what the Vikings end up doing.
So it's not what I would do if the Vikings were there. I think, and we can get into, how we value these guys a little bit, but if he were there at 12 and they passed on one of the top edge rushers or something like that, I would be a little bit frustrated with it, but it's not the end of the world. Like, I kind of ragged on him for his arm length, kind of went a little bit long on a rant there, but I don't think it's a death knell for him as a player. I think that you're right that it is possible to overcome. People talk about tackle arm length all the time, right? And Rashawn Slater doesn't meet the 33-inch threshold for tackle arm length. Guess what? He was a freaking all-pro in his rookie season because he's a dominant player, right? So in some cases, it just doesn't matter with guys. But I don't necessarily want to take the bet that he's going to be the outlier in this case, because I don't think there's significant evidence that his length doesn't matter. As opposed, like Derek Stingley, I'm not concerned about his length because his ball skills are ridiculous, right? Like, you see him routinely make those plays. I'm not worried about the fact that he's got sub 31-inch arms. I don't think you see that level from McDuffie, and that's kind of my question with him. So, long discussion there. Why don't we roll it into the final one and maybe speed it up a little bit because we're going pretty long on this podcast. Kaiir Elam from Florida. My notes
I just have very strong feelings about arm length, Matt.
Yeah, I know. Size matters, we might say. But no, like you said, Nick, an extra inch, I don't know how much that does for you. So no, but Kaiir.
Now I'm on record having that take. So.
No. So Kaiir Elam, first of all, extremely physical corner, extremely physical press man corner, jams guys at the line of scrimmage. Played good competition. Had a game against Alabama with Jameson Williams. I love Jameson Williams. I think he's a fantastic prospect. I thought that Elam had a very good game against Jameson Williams. I thought he shut him down pretty nicely. There were a couple times where Williams beat him, but I thought he had a pretty solid game against him. I think he's got good long speed and athletic traits. I think he's a little bit stiff. He doesn't move as well as any of the other guys we've talked about. Maybe he's pretty close to Sauce in terms of his movement. So, but I think he is going to get beat inside and beat by guys who are quick, and he's very grabby. He is Xavier Rhodes at his worst grabby. He is Trey Waynes at Michigan State grabby. And that's a big concern for me because that's not something that gets called consistently in college football, and that will get called consistently at the NFL level. But I do think he's got good athletic traits. I think he's profiles as a very good man corner, and I can talk myself into him at 12. He's the guy where I wouldn't love it if they take him at 12, but I could talk myself into it based on his athletic profile and his traits and his level of play.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would not take him at 12. I would take him at 48, but I would not take him at 12. I have too many concerns about his grabbiness and his stiffness. I don't think he is a day one starter guaranteed in the way that the last four guys, asterisk around Stingley because there's a chance that he's not good, but there's also the chance that he's the best player in the draft. So, I'm not sure Kaiir Elam is like a day one starter. I think he's got great potential, and I think the flashes are there. Like you said, his games against Bama, like he goes toe to toe with like top level competition and is very good. There's things certainly to like. The length is phenomenal. His press technique is very good. If you can get outside of like the grabby stuff that won't necessarily fly in the NFL, and he got penalized a lot in college too, and they're even more strict about it at the NFL. That's a problem. He's not great from that's probably too harsh, but he's a lot better as like a press man corner than he is from zone, just because I think he's not as bursty, and he's not all that stiffness I think comes into play when he's playing off or when he's playing zone. So I also don't think he's like as good of a fit. This is oversimplifying it, but he's kind of like a budget tier Sauce Gardner in that he's got the length and the press technique, and he would be perfect in like a cover 3 system. And he's very tall, he's very long, but I just don't see necessarily a day one starter with him, and that's kind of where I'm going to draw my line and say, like, I can't use the number 12 pick on a guy who winds up as the backup for the first game of the year. So I just have a little bit more concerns about him. I do think the ball skills are great. I don't have necessarily. He's not great in run defense, but he's not like bad, I guess. In run defense,
it's the Stingley Sauce level of run defense, I think.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
Well, you would hope somebody this big would be a little bit better on run defense, and he's a little plays down to the competition, I guess, a little bit. So that is, I guess, concerning. But at the same time, I think he's a good player, and I think he has a chance to be a starter in the first couple of years in the NFL, and to be like a solid number 2 corner, particularly in a scheme where he's going to be able to use that length, be able to press guys. He doesn't have the traits, I think, to be necessary. I mean, anybody can surprise you, and I don't like putting ceilings on guys necessarily, but I would be a lot more shocked if Elam winds up being like a Pro Bowler than if Stingley winds up being a Pro Bowler. So I don't necessarily see the value, and so that's kind of why I draw kind of like a little bit of a threshold between the first 4 guys we talked about and then everybody else in the draft, because everybody else in the draft I'm not sure is a day one boundary corner starter, or at least in the McDuffie's case, a very good starting nickel day one. So at the least, although I still maintain he can. I think he can stick it at the boundary. So,
Sure.
I don't know. I'm just not as much on board. I liked his tape. I didn't love it, and I have enough question marks where I don't see the value at 12 in him. So that's kind of where I am on Elam.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, like I could talk myself into him as 12. Right, you can go back and I think you can justify it to yourself that you're making that pick. It's not a pick that I love at that position. And another note is, like, he's playing press man. He's playing a lot of man coverage. There's a limited zone sample, so you'd kind of have to project that into what you'd see. And like you said, with some of the stiffness, with the, he doesn't have the movement skills of the other guys. I think he's not quite as movie, so he's maybe not as much of a system fit as everybody else that we've talked about so far today. So why don't we get wrapping this up and finalize it by giving the people what they love, which is the rankings. Why don't you go ahead and rank, and then I'll do it, rank these guys 1 through 5.
Well, this will be a Vikings-specific ranking, because if it were for another team, these rankings would shift. But I would say Sauce Gardner is number 1 with a bullet. I think he's in a separate tier from the rest. And then I would put in the second tier, I would put first, probably... well, actually, no, let me think about it. I think I would put Booth first, and then I would put Stingley, and then I would put McDuffie. They're all in the same tier to me, and I like them all. I just think I think Booth probably first, because I think I have a lot of confidence that he's going to come in and be a solid starter right away, and I think he also has good potential to be a very good pro. Stingley has the most upside, but also I think the biggest bust potential. Not just because of his health, but also because, for all the highlight plays, he's got those low light plays as well. And then McDuffie, I feel like, has a higher ceiling. I think he's a very safe prospect. At the worst, you're getting a good nickel, and at the best, you're getting Antoine Winfield. So I can live with that. But lower ceiling, not necessarily going to be a Jalen Ramsey type shutdown. And Khair Elam in the third tier by himself, just because, like I said, I'm not sure he's a day one starter, and I don't see him as good of a fit for the Vikings. How about you? What are your rankings?
Yeah, so mine actually, the grouping at the top would be pretty tight for me. Number 1 would be Sauce, and then 2 Stingley, 3 Booth, but it's a pretty tight grouping where honestly I don't think that they're all that far apart. I think Booth is the best projection into the Viking system, right? I think Sauce is, like we talked about, is the cleanest evaluation and probably the best corner in the draft overall, with maybe a little bit of a downgrade because of his scheme fit, which kind of brings him in the mold. And the upside on Stingley is just so high to me that I'm kind of tantalized by it, right? So I definitely understand where you're coming at flipping Booth and Stingley and having Booth higher just because you're more confident in that projection, I think. But for Stingley, I think I'm confident that he's still very, very good. And I'm not like, I didn't mind that 2021 UCLA game. I thought he was still a very good player in that game. So, just for me, I'm willing to put him a little bit higher if I have to rank them. Then I have a gap. And those three guys I'm sprinting the card in if they're on the clock at 12. For any of those three guys, I want to take him at 12, and that's my slight preference in terms of order. I would say then there's a gap, and it's McDuffie, right, who I'd like to get in a trade back, and I have those questions that we talked about. And then there's yet another gap. I would say the gap between the top three and McDuffie is slightly larger than the gap between McDuffie and Elam, but that's just kind of a preference thing for me, where Elam's are late first round, early second prospect to me. So that's where I want him.
Interesting. Question for you, because it's kind of interesting. Would you prefer Stingley at 12, or say the Steelers want to trade up for a quarterback? Or would you prefer, say we get the Steelers future first and their number 20 pick, and we take, let's say McDuffie or Booth are on the board, and it's a coin flip which one it's going to be. Would you prefer Stingley and just the upside there, or would you prefer the extra draft capital and get one of those other guys on the board?
If I can get a future first, I'm taking a future first. If I'm at risk of getting the top tier gone and I'm getting an extra third, I probably take the player.
Interesting. Because for me, it's like a slam dunk. Like I said, I see all these guys in a similar tier, and I think Sauce will absolutely be gone. I don't think he gets past the 9, and he'll probably go before that, I think. So if it's like Stingley and all these other guys are on the board, I don't see as big enough of a gap. Obviously, Stingley could wind up being, like I said, I think he's like a Marshawn Lattimore type who could wind up being just like a perfect All-Pro for years, and Vikings could really regret passing on him. I also think between the health and all the other touchdowns he surrendered and all the other explosives he surrendered, that he's got some bust potential as well. So I would love to trade down. And the more that I watch some of these other guys, I'm like, wow, a lot of these guys are all really good. Past Kyer Elam, maybe not as much, but I would be happy trading down. I think there's a lot of value in turn to speaking about like cliffs of value in the draft. That's kind of where I see it. But it's a little more interesting because you're a little bit higher than me on Stingley. But we're also both very high on Booth, probably a little bit higher than consensus on Booth as well. So interesting to think about what the Vikings will actually end up doing, because some of these guys, I think one of these guys will be available. I was just looking at grinding the mock. So Gardner is number 7 currently on the consensus board, or at least grinding the mocks version. Derek Stingley is 8. McDuffie is 20. And Booth is 27. 27 seems really low to me. Kyer Elam is 31 for reference. So they're all first-round talents by the consensus, but those other 3 guys back in the first round and those first 2 guys, that's kind of maybe how the NFL or most prognosticators see them, as there's the first 2 guys and then the next 3 guys. So interesting to see how the rest of the NFL might think about them.
If we can swing a trade back and still draft Andrew Booth in like the early 20s or something like that, I would be over the moon with the way we handle the draft, even if Stingley's on the board there at 12.
That would be a Christian Darrisaw situation, I think, all over again. Like trade back and still get somebody who's like a top 15 talent in my mind. So, talk about draft strategy. That would be the dream there. So
that would once again be the dream. All right, so we're gonna wrap it up here. My name's Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football. He is Nick Olson. You can find him at Nick Olson NFL. We are Kindred Skulls. This is the podcast. You can find us on Spotify, on iTunes, on YouTube. Just search for Kindred Skulls, and wherever else you find your podcasts. You can find us on Twitter at Kindred Skulls, and you can also find our other co-host, Greg Blake, at You've Been Gregged. Again, thanks
in case you forgot which podcast you were listening to after 90 minutes of cornerback discussion.
Yeah, seriously. We went a little long today, guys, but we hope you enjoyed it. And Skull Vikings.
We ground the tape, and we wanted to show our work, man. Like, if I'm going to watch all this tape, I want to actually, put it to use. So, Be sure to give us 5-star reviews. I'm not sure we mentioned that yet, but please do. Makes us happy. And like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And we'll see what the Vikings actually end up doing with these cornerback rooms. But like I said, I'm actually encouraged by how many good options there will be, I think, for the Vikings in the first round. So whether they trade up or trade down or whatever they wind up doing, it's a good class. So I'm excited for it.
Yeah, if we ended up taking a corner in the first round, I don't think I'm going to complain too much about it. So that's what we learned from this exercise at the end of the day. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. Skol Vikings.
Go Vikings. Bye, we love you.
First-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind. And we'll score.